Okay, now that we're sure our program works fine and we're able to call the crawl method from our scanner function and it's able to get us all the links and then store them in my target links variable, I want to address one minor issue. As you can see, when I first create my object, the vulnerability scanner object, I am giving it the target URL, which is great. The target URL is going to be stored in the self.targetURL in the class, and I can access this anywhere I want in my class. But if we look at my code again when I call the crawl, I give it the target URL again. And this doesn't really make sense because I want to only give the target URL once when I create the object, and then when I call the crawl should automatically know that it should start from the target URL that has been given to the class because the value of this is already stored in self.targetURL. Now you might think that doing this is very easy. All I have to do is remove the URL from here, and every time I use URL in the code, I'm gonna use self.targetURL. Now this would be the case if this function wasn't a recursive function. Because this function is a recursive function, it is calling itself in here. And the way that it calls itself with the current link. So every time it calls itself, it's going to call itself on a completely new link. So if I use self.targetURL in here, then I will not be able to use this function to discover all the links in all the web pages. It will only discover the links in one web page, which is the one in the self.targetURL. So what I'm going to do today is actually introduce you to something that is new, simple, and useful, which is using a default value for an argument. So I'm going to keep my crawl method to take a URL argument, but I'm going to say the default value for the URL is none, which basically means I can call this method without specifying a URL, and the method will set the value of URL to none. So this will allow me to call the method like so without specifying a URL, and in this case the value of the URL is going to be set to none, and I can call it with specifying a URL like in here, and in this case the value of the URL is going to be the value passed to the method. Now we still have one problem. If we call the crawl like in here without specifying a URL, then the value for the URL is going to be set to the default value, which is none, because I'm specifying it here as none. You can specify it as anything you want, but I'm setting it as none. Then this is going to be used in my methods in here and throughout the code in here as well. And because this is none, it'll actually crash my code. So I'm going to add a check in here. I'm going to say if my URL is equal to none, then this means this method has been called from outside of this class, not from the recursive call in here, and that means I should start from the target URL. So I'm gonna say my URL is equal to self.targetURL. So in this case, if the method gets called without specifying a URL, the URL is going to be set to self.targetURL, which is the URL that the user sets the target to when they create the scanner. Otherwise, if the URL is passed to the method, then the URL is going to be directly used in the method as the value that is passed to it. This will make our code nicer because right now we can create the object like so, passing it the target URL, and then I can just say I want my vulnerability scanner to start crawling. Now let's go and test this and make sure we didn't break anything. And perfect, as you can see, it's working as expected, giving us a similar result to what we were getting before. So it's just a new and nice tip to know. It's very handy, and you can use it anywhere, not only inside methods. You can use it with functions, and you can set a default value to anything you want. I'm just setting it to none because it makes sense to me in this example.